"You're a thief." The words weren't shouted. They were spoken calmly, precisely into the microphone. They sliced through the applause like glass. My name on everyone's lips a moment before turned to ash in my mouth. The crystal award in my hands felt impossibly heavy, a block of ice burning my skin. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It was a pressure in my ears, a weight on my chest. The hundreds of faces in the ballroom, once a sea of smiling admiration, had become a single monstrous entity with 1,000 staring eyes. They weren't looking at the architect of the year anymore. They were looking at a specimen, a curiosity pinned to a board. My smile was still frozen on my face, a brittle mask I couldn't seem to lower. It was Julian on the stage. Of course it was Julian, my mentor, the man who had handed me my first drafting pencil, who had told me my designs had the bones of a legend. He stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the stage lights, his face a portrait of grave, regretful duty, a performance of a lifetime. "I can't, in good conscience, stand by and watch this happen," he continued, his voice resonating with practiced sorrow. "I can't watch as the city I love is celebrated for a monument built on a lie. A dangerous lie." My legs went numb. I was vaguely aware of my business partner, Mark, stepping closer to me, his hand hovering near my elbow, but he didn't touch me. No one did. It was as if I was surrounded by a force field of shame. The camera flashes started. Not the warm celebratory pops from before, but aggressive predatory strobes. Each flash felt like a physical blow, leaving a black spot dancing in my vision. Behind Julian, on the massive screen that had just been showing a triumphant montage of my work, the Phoenix Tower, an image flickered to life. It was a blueprint. My blueprint. Except it wasn't. It was subtly wrong. The support specifications were different, the material grades were altered. It looked like my design, but it was a corrupted, funhouse mirror version of it. "This," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried to every corner of the silent room, "is Alara Vance's original submission. And this," the image on the screen changed to another nearly identical blueprint, "is the design she stole. The design of a young, promising architect from my own firm, an intern she was supposed to be mentoring. A design she took and passed off as her own." A collective gasp, a ripple of murmurs. The sound was like static, blurring the edges of the world. I couldn't breathe. It was a lie. A complete, total fabrication. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer audacity of it. I tried to find the words to scream, to protest, but my throat had closed up. All I could do was stand there, holding the award, a prop in my own public execution. Julian wasn't finished. He was just getting warmed up. It's not just plagiarism. It's a betrayal of public trust. To cut costs, to meet an impossible deadline for this award ceremony, she approved substandard materials. The changes she made to the original design, they compromised the structural integrity of the entire building. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The Phoenix Tower is not a triumph. It is a catastrophe waiting to happen. The noise in the room changed then. The murmuring grew louder, sharper. I could hear individual words cutting through the din. "Fraud. Unbelievable. My God, the city council." I saw a reporter in the front row speaking frantically into her phone. I was no longer a person. I was a headline. A scandal. My eyes searched the crowd, desperate for a friendly face, for a flicker of belief. I saw my parents in the second row. My mother's hand was over her mouth, her face pale. My father, who had always been my biggest champion, was staring at Julian on the stage, his expression a terrible mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my accuser. Mark finally grabbed my arm. "Alara, we have to go." His voice was a harsh whisper, his grip bruising. He wasn't protecting me. He was managing a crisis. I was no longer his partner, I was a liability. He pulled me toward the side exit, and the movement broke the spell. The press surged forward like a wave. "Ms. Vance, do you have a comment? Is it true you stole the design? Did you knowingly endanger the public? Alara, why would you do this?" The questions were a barrage of stones. Microphones and recorders were shoved in my face. The bright, hot lights of television cameras were blinding. I stumbled, my heels catching on the thick carpet. Mark just pulled harder, his face a grim mask. We were a ship trying to cut through a hurricane. I felt a hand grab my sleeve and I flinched, pulling away. We finally burst through the doors into the sterile quiet of a back corridor. The roar of the ballroom was muffled, but the silence out here was worse. It was hollow, echoing. Mark let go of my arm and immediately pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen. He wouldn't look at me. "Mark," I whispered. My voice was a croak, raw and unused. "Mark, it's not true. You know it's not true." He finally looked up, and the expression in his eyes broke something inside me that the public humiliation hadn't. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disbelief. It was calculation. He was already measuring the fallout, the damage to the firm, to his own reputation. "They have emails, Alara," he said, his voice flat. "Julian showed them emails. Between you and the suppliers. Approving the cheaper steel. They're fake," I said, my voice rising with a desperate, hysterical edge. "He faked them. The blueprints, the emails, all of it. He's lying." "Why?" Mark asked, and that one word was an accusation in itself. "Why would he do this? Risk his entire legacy to ruin you? It doesn't make any sense." But it did. I could see it now in a sickening, clarifying flash. Julian hadn't had a major project in years. He was fading into a respectful but irrelevant retirement. I was his star pupil, the one who had eclipsed him. The Phoenix Tower was my masterpiece, the kind of legacy project he had always craved for himself. He wasn't risking his legacy. He was trying to reclaim it, to burn mine to the ground and build his own on the ashes. But I couldn't explain that to Mark. Not now. Not when he was looking at me like I was a stranger, a criminal. The walk to the car was the longest of my life. A few reporters had found their way to the private exit, and the flashes started again as we stepped out into the cold night air. The city lights, the skyline I had helped to shape, seemed to mock me. The car ride was silent. Mark drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. My phone, which I had left in my clutch, began to vibrate incessantly. It buzzed and buzzed against the leather of the seat, a frantic, angry insect. News alerts. Texts. Missed calls. I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Each vibration was another nail being hammered into my coffin. When he dropped me off at my apartment, a sleek, minimalist space I had designed myself, he didn't get out of the car. "Don't talk to anyone, Alara," he said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "Not the press, not your family, no one. We need a lawyer. We need a PR firm. We need to get ahead of this." The word felt like a lie. There was no we anymore. There was just me and the disaster that was now my life. "He's been planning this, Mark," I said, my hand on the door handle. "For months. The intern he mentioned, Leo? I fired him 6 months ago. For trying to sell our preliminary designs to a rival firm. Julian begged me to give him a second chance. I thought he was being compassionate." Mark finally turned his head. "You fired him? And you didn't tell me?" "It was handled," I said numbly. "I didn't want to bother you. It was a minor issue." A minor issue. A loose thread that Julian had patiently pulled until my entire world unraveled. Mark just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "Go inside, Alara. I'll call you in the morning." I got out of the car and didn't look back as he drove away. The lobby of my building was empty, but the doorman, a friendly man who usually greeted me with a wide smile, just gave me a tight, uncomfortable nod and busied himself with a newspaper. My face was on the front page. I could see the headline even from a distance. Architect of the Year or Architect of Deceit? Inside my apartment, the silence was absolute. The space, which had always felt like a sanctuary, a testament to my belief in clean lines and honest materials, now felt like a tomb. My awards were lined up on a floating shelf in the living room. Little golden statues, framed certificates, and at the end of the shelf, the space I had cleared for the crystal tower I was still clutching in my hand. I walked over and placed it there. It didn't look like a trophy. It looked like a weapon. the weapon that had been used against me. I stared at my reflection in the polished surfaces of my home. The woman looking back at me was a ghost. Her makeup was perfect, her designer dress was immaculate, but her eyes were hollowed out, dark with a shock that was too deep for tears. My phone buzzed again, this time in my hand. It was a text from my father. I braced myself, praying for a message of support, of love, of belief. The message read, "Alara, please just tell me it's not true. Please just tell me." He wasn't stating his belief. He was asking for it. He was asking for a reason to believe in his own daughter. And in that moment, I understood the true genius of Julian's attack. He hadn't just attacked my career. He had poisoned the very foundations of my life, turning love into doubt and trust into suspicion. I sank onto the cold marble floor, my back against the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in the deafening silence of my perfect empty apartment. The city hummed outside my floor-to-ceiling windows, a world that was moving on without me, a world that now believed I was a fraud. And in the silence I heard the sound of my life breaking, a clean, quiet, and irreversible snap. My name is Eleanor. Though for most of my life, I've simply been a reflection of other people's needs. A wife. A mother. Now at 62, I find myself sitting in a house that is too quiet. A silence that seems to magnify the sound of my own breathing. The sun comes through the kitchen window just as it always has, catching the same dust motes that have danced in this light for 30 years. This house isn't just wood and nails. It's a living archive of my life, and every scuff on the floorboards, every faint stain on the countertop, tells a piece of my story. A story I thought I knew the ending to. I suppose my story really begins with Richard. It always has. Before him, I was just a girl with vague watercolor dreams of owning a small bookstore, the kind with a purring cat and the smell of old paper and tea. I loved the feel of a story in my hands, the weight of a world I could step into. But then I met Richard, and he was a world all his own. He wasn't a book. He was a force of nature. A hurricane of ambition and charisma with eyes that saw a future so bright it almost hurt to look at. When he looked at me, I felt not just seen but chosen. He had a blueprint for a life, a grand design, and he asked me to be the foundation. How could I say no? Love in those early days felt like a promise of adventure, a shared climb to a beautiful summit. I didn't realize that my role was to carry the supplies, to set up the camp, and to make sure the path was clear for him to ascend. We started with nothing. Our first apartment was a cramped little box above a bakery, where the smell of rising bread was our constant companion. It was a sweet, hopeful scent that masked the faint odor of mildew in the bathroom. Richard had just started his construction business, and every dollar we had was poured back into it. My own small savings, meant for that dream of a bookstore, bought his first set of professional grade tools. I watched him unwrap them, his hands tracing the cool steel with a reverence I had never seen before. There wasn't a moment of regret. Seeing the fire in his eyes was worth more than any dusty old bookstore. His dream became my dream by osmosis, by love. My life began to take on a new shape, one that was molded around his. I was the one who woke up hours before him to make the coffee that would fuel his long days. I was the one who packed his lunch, always with a little note tucked inside. A silly doodle or a simple, "I love you." I became his bookkeeper, his receptionist, his unpaid administrator. I remember nights spent at our wobbly kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating piles of invoices and receipts. I learned to balance ledgers, to chase down payments with a polite but firm voice on the phone, all while Richard slept the deep, exhausted sleep of a man who was physically building his empire, one brick at a time. I never felt like it was a sacrifice. Felt like teamwork. We were a unit building something together. He was the architect and the builder. I was the scaffolding, the logistics, the quiet, unseen support that made it all possible. Then came the children. First Michael, then Sarah. And my world, which had already shrunk to the size of Richard's ambition, now contracted to the size of our small, growing home. It was a beautiful, chaotic, all-consuming shrinkage. My days became a blur of lullabies and scraped knees, of bedtime stories and endless loads of laundry. The smell of baby powder replaced the smell of old books. The sound of tiny feet running down the hallway became my favorite song. Richard was working harder than ever, his business finally taking off. He would come home late, smelling of sawdust and accomplishment, and I would have a hot meal waiting for him, the children bathed and ready to give their father a goodnight kiss. He'd look around at the clean, orderly home, at his happy, well-fed children, and he'd smile at me with such gratitude. "I couldn't do any of this without you, Elle," he'd say, and that was all the payment I ever needed. It was my fuel. We bought this house when Michael was 5. It was a shell back then, but Richard saw the potential. And over the years he, with his own 2 hands, turned it into a home. But I was the one who turned it into a life. I chose the color of the paint on the walls, a warm buttery yellow that I hoped would always feel like sunshine, even on the grayest days. I planted the rose bushes in the front yard, the ones that still bloom every June, their scent drifting through the open windows. I was the one who measured the children's height on the pantry doorframe, a ladder of pencil marks charting their journey from toddlers to teenagers who had to duck to get through the door. My life was 1,000 tiny, invisible acts of service. It was sewing a button on Richard's shirt an hour before a big meeting. It was remembering his business partner's wife's birthday and sending flowers. It was hosting dinner parties where I'd spend 2 days cooking, creating an atmosphere of effortless grace so Richard could network and charm his clients. He was the star, and I was the stage manager, working tirelessly in the wings to make sure his spotlight never flickered. My friends would sometimes ask, "Eleanor, but what about you? What do you do?" And I'd smile and say, "I'm a wife and a mother." I said it with pride. It was my identity, my purpose. I had poured all of myself into my family, into Richard, until I wasn't sure where I ended and they began. There was no line. We were a single entity. And he was my everything. My best friend, my confidant, the keeper of all my secrets. He was the only person who knew I was terrified of thunderstorms, and he would hold me until the last rumble faded away. He was the one who encouraged me to take up painting again when the kids were older, who bought me a beautiful easel and a set of oils for our 25th anniversary. I set it up in the spare room, but I rarely used it. There was always something else to do. A garden to weed, a meal to plan, a call to make for the business. There was always a reason to put myself second, or third, or fourth. When the children finally left for college, the silence they left behind was deafening. The house felt cavernous. For the first time I felt a strange, unfamiliar pang of what was it? Not regret. Maybe a sense of being untethered. My primary job was over. But then I looked at Richard, his hair now more silver than brown, the lines around his eyes deeper from years of work and worry, and I knew my job wasn't over. It had just changed. Now my purpose was to be his partner in this new, quieter chapter. We would travel, he promised. We would spend more time together. He was talking about slowing down, maybe even retiring in a few years. We would finally get to enjoy the fruits of our shared labor. So I settled into this new rhythm. I focused all my energy on him, on our home. I learned to cook his favorite meals even better. I made sure the house was his sanctuary, a peaceful haven from the stresses of the world. He was the center of my universe, the sun my little planet revolved around. I trusted him with my past, my present, and my future. I had given him my youth, my dreams, my body, my entire life, and I did it willingly, joyfully. Because in my mind we were one. His success was my success. His happiness was my happiness. I had built my entire world on the foundation of his love and his promises. It was a beautiful house, I thought. Solid and secure. I never once thought to check for cracks in the foundation. I never imagined that the man I had given everything to could ever be the one to cause the whole thing to come crashing down. I trusted him completely. And that, I would soon learn, was my greatest mistake. The silence in this house has a sound. It's the low electronic hum of the refrigerator, a constant indifferent presence. It's the whisper of the central air kicking on, a sterile breath that doesn't quite manage to clear the tension from the room. My son Mark bought this house with his wife Sarah, a few seasons after my Arthur passed. It's all clean lines and shades of gray. A place where memories don't seem to stick to the walls. I've been here since the leaves turned gold last autumn, a guest in the final chapter of my own life. My day begins before the sun. The arthritis in my hands is a cruel alarm clock. I move quietly down the hallway, my worn slippers making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. In the kitchen, the glow from under the cabinets illuminates gleaming quartz countertops. The coffee maker, a complicated machine with more buttons than a cockpit, sits silent. It is for them, Mark and Sarah. My coffee is instant. Sarah bought me a jar of it when I first arrived. It's simpler for you, Eleanor, she'd said, her voice full of a bright, sharp kindness that felt like polished glass. No fuss. She'd placed it on a low shelf in the pantry, next to a chipped ceramic mug with a faded floral pattern. My mug. My coffee. A separate world just an arm's length from theirs. I fill the electric kettle with water, the only small appliance that feels like it belongs to me, and wait for its quiet rumble to build to a boil. Through the large window over the sink, I watch the sky slowly blush from deep indigo to a soft, hazy lavender. This is my time. The only time the house feels still, before the day's small cuts begin. The first sound of them stirring is the soft thud of Mark's feet on the floor above, then the rush of the shower. Soon Sarah will come down, her movements crisp and efficient. She doesn't say good morning. She glides to the coffee machine, the scent of expensive, freshly ground beans filling the air. A scent that is not for me. It's a wall of aroma that separates my instant brew from their artisanal roast. She prepares their mugs, two large identical gray ones that match the kitchen decor. She moves with a practiced economy, never a wasted step. Her eyes might slide over me, sitting at the small, wobbly card table she set up for me in the corner by the pantry, but there is no recognition. I am part of the furniture, a piece that no longer matches the set. Mark, coffee's ready, she calls, her voice bright and clear. My son comes down dressed for work and kisses her. He gives me a small smile, a fleeting thing that never quite meets his eyes. Morning, Mom. Good morning, dear. I say, my voice a little rough from disuse. They stand by the island sipping their coffee, talking about their day. Their voices are a low murmur, a conversation I am not a part of. They discuss their plans, their colleagues, the kids' school projects. I stir my watery coffee in my chipped mug, the spoon making a tiny, lonely clinking sound. Sometimes little Leo, their youngest, will wander in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He'll go to his mother, burying his face in her side. She'll stroke his hair and not look at me. It's a lesson taught in silence. Grandma is over there. We are over here. Breakfast is the same. They eat at the island on tall, modern stools. Sarah makes them oatmeal with fresh berries and nuts, or avocado toast on thick artisan bread. For me, there is a box of plain bran flakes on my card table, next to the sugar bowl and a small carton of milk. It was explained early on that it was better for my digestion. Another kindness that feels like a cage. I eat my cereal, the crunching loud in my own ears, and watch the life of the house unfold from my designated corner. I am present yet absent, a ghost at the feast. The afternoons are the longest. The children, Leo and Maya, come home from school. They burst through the door with the force of a small hurricane, dropping backpacks, shouting for snacks. I used to try to greet them, to ask about their day. Hi, sweethearts, how was school? I'd say, my hands clasped in my lap. Maya, the older one, might give me a quick fine before rushing past. Leo learned his cues from his mother. He just looks at me, his expression blank, and follows his sister to the kitchen where Sarah waits with organic apple slices and cheese sticks. One day, I heard Sarah talking to him in the other room, her voice low and instructive. You don't have to talk to her every time, sweetie. Grandma needs her quiet time. We don't want to bother her. Bother. That's what I am. A bother. A disturbance in the smooth, gray surface of their lives. So I stopped trying. I just sit in the wingback chair in the living room, my other designated spot, and watch. The television, a flat black mirror on the wall, is another country I cannot visit. Sarah set a password on it. It's for the kids, she explained, not looking at me, to control their screen time. But when the kids want to watch, she types in the code without a thought. When they are in bed and she and Mark are watching a show, the sound fills the house. If I linger wanting to watch with them, Sarah will say, Eleanor, it's getting late. You must be tired. It is not a question. It is a dismissal. I retreat to my chair. It's a comfortable chair, I'll give them that. A relic from my old house that they allowed me to bring. It sits at an odd angle to the main sofa, not quite part of the conversational grouping, like an afterthought. When they have guests, which isn't often, I am an awkward fixture. Sarah introduces me with a quick, "And this is Mark's mother, Eleanor." Her tone makes it clear that my presence is an obligation, not a joy. The guests offer polite smiles, and then the conversation flows around me, leaving me on a quiet island of floral upholstery. Dinner is the most difficult ritual. The dining table is a long, beautiful slab of reclaimed wood that seats 8. There are 6 matching chairs. Mark and Sarah sit at the heads of the table. Maya and Leo sit on one side. The other 2 chairs on their side remain empty. On the other side, a single chair sits, also empty. I do not sit at the table. The first week I was here, I naturally moved to take a seat. Sarah stopped me, a hand on my arm, her touch light but firm. "Oh, Eleanor, let's not have you at the big table. It's so far to carry your plate, and what if you spilled? I have a perfect spot for you." The perfect spot was the wobbly card table from the kitchen, moved into the dining room. It sits near the doorway like a child's table at a grown-up party. My meal is served on a plastic plate, a bright blue one that belongs to a set for the children. They're non-breakable. Sarah had chirped. "No worries." So I eat my dinner from a blue plastic plate at a wobbly card table, while my family sits 10 feet away at a beautiful wooden table, eating from heavy ceramic dinnerware. They talk. They laugh. The sound of their silver forks scraping against their plates is different from the dull tap of my spoon against plastic. Mark will sometimes glance over, a flicker of something in his eyes. Is it guilt? Pity? But it's gone as soon as it appears. He'll turn back to Sarah, back to a joke Leo is telling, and I will vanish again. Last night Sarah made roasted chicken. The smell filled the house, rich and savory with rosemary and garlic. On their plates were generous cuts of juicy breast meat, roasted potatoes, and bright green asparagus. My plate was brought to me by Sarah. It held a small chicken wing, a scoop of plain white rice, and some overboiled carrots. She set it down in front of me. "A simpler meal for you," she said, her voice the same as always. "Easier to chew." I looked down at the wing. It was dry and pale. I looked up at my son. He was cutting his daughter's chicken into small, manageable bites, his head bent, his focus entirely on her plate. He didn't see my plate. He didn't see the meagerness of the portion or the insult of the presentation. Or if he did, he chose to say nothing. The silence of my son is the heaviest burden of all. It's a silence that condones, that accepts, that tells me my new place in the world is this small, wobbly table. I ate what I could. The carrots were mush, the rice was bland. Every swallow felt like I was swallowing my own pride, my own history. I used to host Thanksgiving for 30 people. My roasts were legendary. My hands, now twisted with arthritis, once kneaded bread and rolled out pie crusts that made my husband's eyes light up. Now these hands struggle to hold a plastic fork steady. After dinner, the family moves to the living room. The television is turned on, the code swiftly entered. The sounds of a sitcom fill the air, punctuated by my family's laughter. I am not invited to join them, not with words but with a wall of indifference. I clear my own plastic plate, rinse it in the sink, and place it on the drying rack, separate from the ceramic dishes that will go into the dishwasher. Then I make my slow journey back to my room. It's the guest room at the end of the hall. It's painted the same neutral gray as the rest of the house. My few photographs of Arthur, of a younger Mark, of my wedding day, sit on the nightstand, small squares of a vibrant, colorful past and a muted monochrome present. I sit on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under my slight weight. The laughter from the living room travels down the hall. A faint, muffled sound. Feels a million miles away. Each day is a series of these tiny bloodless cuts. The instant coffee. The forgotten greeting. The plastic plate. The locked television. The way my son's eyes slide past me. None of them are a singular catastrophic event. There is no shouting, no overt cruelty I could point to and say, "See? This is wrong." It is a slow, methodical erosion of self. I am being carefully, quietly, and politely erased. And the most painful part, the part that keeps me awake as the house finally settles into true deep silence, is that they are doing it with my son's permission. I am a stranger in my own blood's house. I am the silence that exists between the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the central air. And I don't know how many more sunrises I can bear to watch, knowing that each one will only bring more of the same quiet, suffocating heartbreak. The days just bleed into one another, a long gray smear of time. It's the repetition that wears you down. It's knowing that tomorrow's breakfast will be bran flakes in the corner, that tomorrow's dinner will be a lesser meal on a plastic plate. It's the certainty of the indignity. The first step felt like walking off a cliff in slow motion. I had the name of a lawyer from a legal aid society, a Mr. Davies, whose office was in a part of town I usually only drove through. The building smelled of old paper and stale coffee, a scent I'd come to associate with desperation. I sat opposite him, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. I told him everything. I told him about my son Mark and his wife Sarah. I told him about the papers I'd signed when my husband Robert had first gotten sick, papers I was told were for hospital administration, for managing his care. I told him how, after Robert passed, those papers had somehow become a transfer of all my assets, my home, everything, into Mark's name. Mr. Davies listened with a practiced patience that wasn't comforting at all. It was the patience of a man waiting for a bus that is always late. He steepled his fingers, his eyes drifting over my head to a water-stained spot on the ceiling. "Mrs. Gable," he began, his voice a dry rustle of leaves, "you're alleging that your son, your only child, defrauded you. That he and his wife forged your signature on a durable power of attorney, and then used it to, essentially, steal your life savings and your home." "I didn't say forged," I corrected, my voice trembling slightly. "I signed something, but they told me it was for the hospital." I was distraught. Robert was fading. I would have signed anything to help him. "And you have no copies of what you signed?" "No. They took care of everything. They said, 'Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. We've got it covered.'" The memory of Sarah's saccharine smile made my stomach turn. He sighed, a long weary sound. "Do you have any proof of this misrepresentation? Any emails, texts, a witness?" I shook my head, feeling a familiar shame creep up my neck. I had trusted them. That was my crime. It was just us. In the kitchen. They brought the papers over. Mr. Davies leaned back, the old leather of his chair groaning in protest. "Mrs. Gable, Eleanor, I need to be frank. This is an uphill battle. A monumental one. It's your word against your son's. You admit to signing documents. They have your signature. And forgive me for bringing this up, but the court will. There's the matter of the debt you accumulated after your husband's initial diagnosis." The air left my lungs. My great mistake. The shame bloomed from a small heat in my neck to a wildfire across my face. After Robert's diagnosis, I'd been unmoored. I'd sought comfort in foolish things, in spending. I tried to fill the cavernous hole in my life with new furniture, trips I couldn't afford, clothes I never wore. It was a brief, manic period of grief, but Mark had used it like a weapon ever since. He and Sarah had stepped in to help me manage my finances. "That was I was grieving," I whispered. "It wasn't me." "I understand," he said, though his eyes told me he didn't. "But to a judge, it looks like a pattern of poor financial judgment. Your son's attorneys will paint a picture of a loving son stepping in to protect his mother from herself. They will say you gave him power of attorney willingly, to prevent you from losing the very house you're now fighting for. And they will win." His words were not cruel, but they were a verdict. He saw me not as a victim but as a liability. A confused old woman, unreliable and emotional, who had made a mess and now wanted someone else to clean it up. He was obstacle number one, the gatekeeper who didn't believe in the cause. He agreed to take the case, but with the enthusiasm of a man accepting a death sentence. He told me to go home and try to find anything at all that could corroborate my story. I left his office feeling smaller and more foolish than when I'd entered. The letter arrived 3 days later. It wasn't in a normal envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, with the name of a law firm embossed in stark black lettering in the top left corner. Haddad, Sterling, and Croft. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with a future I didn't want. I slid it open with a kitchen knife, my hand shaking. The language inside was a foreign dialect of English, all heretofores and cease and desists. It was a formal notice that Mark and Sarah had retained legal counsel to protect their interests against my baseless and slanderous accusations. It spoke of my documented history of financial instability and my emotional distress following my husband's passing. It was Mr. Davies's speech, but weaponized, polished, and aimed directly at my heart. The letter informed me that any further contact I made with my son or his wife should be through their attorneys. It ended by stating that they had filed a petition for a restraining order, citing my erratic behavior and the distress I was causing them. Distress. I was causing them distress. I sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the one Robert had built with his own hands 60 years ago. The table where I'd helped Mark with his homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where he and Sarah had sat and smiled as they slid the papers of my ruin in front of me. The letter was a declaration of war. Mark wasn't just defending himself, he was actively attacking. He was building a fortress of lies and using my own grief, my own mistakes as the stones. This was obstacle number 2. The full terrifying force of what my son was willing to do. He wasn't just taking my house. He was taking my history, my sanity, my very identity as his mother. The days that followed blurred into a gray fog of anxiety. I lived in the house, but it was no longer my home. It was a museum of a life I used to have. Mark and Sarah had been redecorating, before I'd finally found the courage to speak up. They had packed away most of my personal belongings into boxes and stacked them in the garage, replacing them with cold, minimalist furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine for people with no memories. My wedding photos were gone from the mantel, replaced by an abstract metal sculpture. The worn armchair where Robert used to read was gone, its place taken by a sleek, uncomfortable-looking white chaise lounge. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, felt like an accusation. I was a ghost haunting my own life, and the internal battle was relentless. At night I'd lie awake, the legal jargon from the letter echoing in my head. But my mind would betray me, drifting back to when Mark was a boy. I'd remember the weight of his small hand in mine, the smell of his hair after a bath, the fierce, unconditional love I had for him. I remembered his scraped knees, his science fair projects, the pride on his face at his high school graduation. How could that boy become this man? The guilt was a physical weight. Had I done something wrong? Was I a bad mother? Did I spoil him? Did I not prepare him for the world? The love I still felt for him was a cancer, eating away at my resolve. I'd pick up the phone to call Mr. Davies and tell him to drop it all, that it was a mistake. Then I'd remember the coldness in Mark's eyes the last time I tried to talk to him, the way he'd looked right through me as if I were a stranger. The fight wasn't just for a house. It was a fight for the truth of who I was, of who Robert was, of the life we had built. This was the true war, the one fought inside my own skull, where love and betrayal were locked in a fight to the death. My search for evidence was a pathetic, desperate scramble. This was the third obstacle, the sheer practical impossibility of my task. I was looking for a needle in a haystack that had been rearranged by the very people who'd hidden the needle. I went through the boxes in the garage, my own life curated and packed away by my daughter-in-law. It was a humiliating archaeology. I found photo albums, old letters from my parents, Robert's military service medals. Treasures of the heart, but useless in a court of law. I needed bank statements, old tax returns, the original deed to the house, anything that predated Mark's takeover. I called the bank, but they told me that since Mark had power of attorney, all statements were now sent to him, and they couldn't release old records to me without his consent. It was a perfect circular trap. I couldn't prove I was the rightful owner without the documents, and I couldn't get the documents without proving I was the rightful owner. I spent an entire afternoon in the attic, breathing in the dust of decades. I went through Robert's old steamer trunk, hoping he'd squirreled something away. I found his high school yearbook, a collection of fishing lures, and a bundle of letters I'd written to him when he was stationed overseas. I sat on the dusty floor and read them, my own words from a lifetime ago, full of hope and love. The tears came then, hot and silent. I wasn't just crying for my house, or for Robert. I was crying for the young woman who had written those letters. A woman who believed in forever, who could never have imagined this lonely, bewildering end. Mr. Davies called a week after the letter from Mark's lawyers arrived. His tone was even flatter than before. "Eleanor," he said, foregoing any pleasantries, "I've had a conversation with a Mr. Sterling, your son's attorney. They are not going to budge. They have a signed, notarized document granting your son durable power of attorney. He says it was your idea, a way to protect your assets after your spending spree. He says you were lucid and willing when you signed it." "He's lying," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you have anything for me, Eleanor? Anything at all? A piece of paper? The name of the notary who was supposedly there." "I don't know who the notary was. It was just a man they brought with them. It was all so fast." He sighed again, that terrible final sound. "They're prepared to countersue for the money they've spent on the home's upkeep and property taxes since they took over management. They'll claim you are harassing them. Eleanor, I advise you to drop this. You could end up with nothing and a mountain of legal fees. Sometimes the best you can do is walk away. Walk away. Walk away from my life. From the home Robert and I poured every ounce of our being into for 60 years? The thought was so obscene, so impossible, that it jolted me out of my despair and into a cold, hard anger. "No," I said, my voice clear and firm for the first time in weeks. "I am not dropping it." I could almost hear him shrug over the phone. "Very well. But without evidence, my hands are tied. The preliminary hearing is in 3 weeks. If we have nothing by then, the judge will likely dismiss it." The line went dead. 3 weeks. I had 3 weeks to find a miracle. The house grew more oppressive with each passing day. I felt like a prisoner on death row, counting down my final hours in a place that held all my joy and all my sorrow. I stopped searching. I had looked everywhere, in every drawer, every closet, every box. There was nothing. I was defeated. My son had one. One evening I couldn't bear the sterile silence of the living room any longer. I went down to the basement. It was the one place Sarah hadn't touched. It was Robert's sanctuary. His workshop was exactly as he'd left it the day he went to the hospital for the last time. A half-finished birdhouse sat on the workbench, a fine layer of dust covering the smooth pine. His tools hung in perfect order on the pegboard wall, their outlines traced in black marker. The air smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and him. I ran my hand over the scarred surface of the workbench, my fingers tracing the grooves and nicks left by decades of loving work. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just saying goodbye. I sat on his old stool, letting the quiet memories wash over me. I remembered him down here for hours, the sound of his saw a comforting hum throughout the house. He called it making sawdust. My eyes drifted around the room, taking in every detail. His old radio on the shelf, a jar full of assorted screws and nails, and a small, intricately carved wooden box on a high shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of old woodworking magazines. I'd seen it before, but had never paid it much mind. It was one of his last projects, a little thing he'd whittled from a block of cherry wood. He'd been so proud of it. On a whim, I stood on the stool and reached for it. It was heavier than it looked. The lid was a beautiful swirling grain. I brought it over to the workbench and sat down, running my thumb over the smooth wood. I opened it. Inside, it was a mess of odds and ends, Robert's little treasures. A ticket stub from a baseball game in 1978. A perfectly smooth stone from our trip to the coast. A couple of his favorite graphite pencils worn down to stubs. A dried rose from our 50th anniversary. My heart ached. It was a box of memories. And then I saw it, nestled in a bed of old wood shavings. A key. It was small and brass, the kind you'd use for a diary or a small lockbox. It wasn't a house key or a car key. It was nondescript, easily overlooked. Why would he keep this one simple key in his most precious box of memories? I held the small key in the palm of my hand. It was cold and solid, felt like a question. I stared at it, and a memory flickered, hazy and indistinct. It was from after his diagnosis, one of his more lucid days. We were sitting on the porch. He was holding my hand, his was so thin then. He'd been rambling, his thoughts skipping like a stone on water. He'd said something about keeping things safe. Not in a bank, Ellie, he'd said, his voice a soft rasp. Banks can be a mess. You keep what's important close. Someplace solid. Someplace you build yourself. At the time, I dismissed it as the confused talk of a sick man. I'd patted his hand and told him not to worry. But now, holding this key, his words came back to me with a chilling clarity. Someplace you build yourself. My eyes shot around the workshop. His workshop. His kingdom. He had built the shelves, the cabinets, the workbench itself. The workbench was a massive thing, made of solid oak, impossibly heavy. He'd built it to last forever. I ran my hands along the edges, under the lip, knocking on the thick legs. Solid. I pulled at the drawers. They were full of chisels, clamps, and sandpaper. Nothing. I stood back, frustration mounting. Was this another dead end? A fantasy born of desperation? I looked at the bench again, at the sheer, immovable solidity of it. Mark and Sarah would never have looked here. It was too heavy, too dirty, too Robert. They wanted to erase him, not excavate his life. My gaze fell to the floor. The concrete was old and cracked. But directly under the center of the workbench, there was one floorboard that didn't quite match the others. It was a section of old hardwood flooring Robert had used to create a more comfortable spot to stand, to insulate his feet from the cold concrete. It was dark with age and oil stains, but one section the grain seemed to run in a slightly different direction. My heart began to pound, a frantic, hopeful drum against my ribs. I got down on my hands and knees. The workbench was too heavy to move, but there was a small gap underneath. I slid my fingers into the dark, dusty space. I felt along the edges of the floorboards. Most were sealed tight with the grime of ages. But then my fingertips caught on a slight ridge. A seam. I pushed. Nothing. I wedged my fingernails into the crack and pulled. A low groan of old wood, and the board lifted slightly. It was a lid. A small, perfectly fitted trapdoor disguised as a floorboard. With my breath caught in my throat, I pried it open. Beneath it was a hollowed-out space in the concrete, and nestled inside was a gray metal document box. It had a small, simple lock on the front. I scrambled back to the bench, my hands trembling so hard I could barely pick up the small brass key. I knelt down again, the smell of damp earth and secrets filling my nostrils. I pushed the key into the lock. Slid in perfectly. With a small, hesitant turn, there was a soft metallic click that echoed in the silent basement like a gunshot. I lifted the lid. Inside there was a stack of papers, all in protective plastic sleeves. On top was the original deed to our house, signed by me and Robert 60 years ago. Beneath that was his original, notarized last will and testament, leaving everything to me and only to me. Tucked underneath that was a long handwritten letter addressed to me. For my Ellie, in case I'm not there to say it. My hands shook as I unfolded it. His familiar, strong handwriting filled the page. He wrote of his love for me, and then of his fear. He wrote about Mark. About his gambling debts he'd discovered. About his manipulative nature that he'd tried to ignore for years. He's our son and I love him, he wrote. But he has a weakness in his character, Ellie. A hunger that is never satisfied. Be careful. Don't let him talk you into anything. He will use your good heart against you. It was a validation. A voice from the grave telling me I wasn't crazy. Robert had seen it. He had known. The tears I shed now weren't of sorrow, but of a fierce, burning relief. And at the very bottom of the box there was one more thing. It was a small, cheap microcassette recorder, the kind a journalist might use. Next to it was a single tiny tape, with a small, neat label on it written in Robert's hand. The label had only 3 words. The kitchen table. The morning light always cut across the floor in the same way. A sharp, unforgiving blade of white on the worn hardwood. For weeks I'd watched it, timed it. It would hit the edge of the cheap rug at 7:04 a.m., creep across the faded floral pattern, and touch the leg of the wobbly kitchen table by 7:19. It was a predictable, reliable sort of pain. A constant reminder that the world kept spinning on its axis, even if mine had been knocked clean off. I made coffee. The ritual was an anchor. The hiss of the water, the grind of the beans, the earthy smell that filled my tiny studio apartment. It was a process, a series of steps that required focus. Scoop, pour, wait. It left little room for the other thoughts, the ones that came in the dead of night, sharp and jagged. I drank it black, leaning against the counter, staring at the brick wall of the building next door. My phone buzzed. It was a picture message from my mother. A photo of David, my brother, standing on the deck of a new boat, his arm around his wife Sarah. They were both grinning, champagne flutes held high. The sun glinted off the Rolex on his wrist, a new one. The caption read, "A little celebration for all the hard work. We miss you." I stared at the image, at the perfect manufactured joy. I saw the calculation in Sarah's eyes, the casual arrogance in my brother's posture. It didn't burn anymore. The white-hot rage had cooled into something harder, denser, something like steel. I typed back a single word. Lovely. I added a smiling emoji, a simple, plastic, meaningless smile. I set the phone down and finished my coffee. The bitterness was grounding. Later that day, I took the subway downtown. Not to the glittering glass towers where our company, now his company, resided. I went further, to a part of the city where the buildings were older, made of stone and history. The kind of buildings that had seen fortunes rise and fall 100 times over. I wore a simple gray dress, my hair pulled back, no makeup. I looked like a ghost of my former self, which was precisely the point. Let them think I was fading. Let them get comfortable. The law office of Harrison and Croft was on the 7th floor of one of these stone buildings. There was no marble lobby, no panoramic city views. The floors were dark wood. The air smelled of old paper and lemon polish. A woman with silver hair and kind eyes looked up from a thick book as I entered. "I have an appointment with Mr. Harrison. My name is Anna Reed." She smiled softly. "Of course, Ms. Reed. He's expecting you. Right this way." Arthur Harrison was not what I expected. He wasn't a shark in a pinstripe suit. He was a man who looked more like a history professor, with a tweed jacket patched at the elbows and a chaotic desk piled high with books and legal pads. He stood up as I entered, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ms. Reed, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." His voice was a low, calm baritone. I sat in the worn leather chair opposite his desk. I didn't speak. I just opened my purse and took out a single thin folder. I slid it across the polished surface of his desk. He looked at it, then at me, his gaze analytical, patient. He opened it. Inside was a single document. Not a dramatic piece of evidence, not a smoking gun. It was a preliminary prospectus for a land acquisition deal our company had made 3 years ago. A deal I had personally structured. A deal David had used in the final board meeting as proof of my reckless overspending and poor judgment, the cornerstone of his case to have me removed. Harrison read it. He read it again. His fingers, stained with ink, traced the lines of text. He was a man who understood the language of contracts, the nuance hidden in every clause and subclause. "This is the initial proposal for the Black Creek development," he stated, not as a question. "Yes," I said. My voice was even quiet. "Your brother's presentation to the board cited the final purchase price as being 30% higher than this initial valuation. He claimed you pushed it through despite warnings from the finance department." "He was correct," I said. "The final price was higher." Harrison looked at me, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "I'm not sure I understand why you're showing me this then." I reached into my purse again and placed a small, worn, leather-bound journal on his desk next to the folder. That belonged to my father. He opened it carefully. My father's elegant, looping script filled the pages. He wasn't a man for diaries, but he kept meticulous notes on every major decision, every deal. It was his way of thinking, of processing. Harrison flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. He stopped on a page dated a week before the Black Creek deal was finalized. His eyebrows rose slightly. He read the passage aloud, his voice barely a whisper. Met with Marcus Thorne of the Zoning Commission. Drinks at the old club. He hinted at the new city expansion plan. The Black Creek parcel will be adjacent to the new light rail transit hub. The value will triple overnight. David is focused on the upfront cost. He can't see the long game. Anna does. She sees the whole board. Must acquire that land whatever the cost. It's the company's future. Harrison closed the journal gently. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw not just a lawyer but a strategist. He saw the shape of the game I was starting to play. The transit hub was announced 18 months after the purchase, he said. Our company's stock value doubled in a week, I added. David and Sarah sold a significant portion of their shares at the peak. I held on to mine. He used your greatest success against you, Harrison mused, leaning back in his chair. He painted your foresight as recklessness, knowing the board had short memories and were focused on the initial outlay, not the eventual massive profit. He told a part of the story, I corrected him. The part that suited him. He left out the context. He left out our father's explicit directive. And this journal, he tapped it with a long finger. This provides the context. It provides my father's state of mind, his strategy. It proves I was executing his vision for the company's long-term stability, not being a rogue agent. He was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the journal. The only sound in the room was the distant wail of a siren and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. This is a good start, Ms. Reed. A very good start. But a personal journal, while compelling, can be challenged in a corporate dispute. It speaks to intent, but we need more. We need to find the paper trail that proves he knew. Proof that he understood the deal's potential, celebrated it, and then deliberately misrepresented it later to oust you. I know, I said. I stood up. That's why I came to you. I need you to find the things I can't. I need you to look at every email, every expense report, every wire transfer David has made in the last 3 years. Especially the ones that seem to have nothing to do with the company. That will be expensive, he warned, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. The company my father built is worth more to me than money, I said. Find it. He nodded slowly. I will be in touch. I walked out of his office and back into the anonymous city streets. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a cold, quiet hum of purpose. The first piece was on the board. The charade continued. That weekend, my mother insisted on a family brunch. To clear the air, she'd said, her voice trembling with a desperate need for everything to be okay. I agreed. I arrived at their house, the house I grew up in, and it felt like a foreign country. David and Sarah were already there, radiating success. Sarah, dressed in a white linen dress that probably cost more than my month's rent, rushed to hug me. Anna! Oh, it's so good to see you. We've been so worried. Her voice was a symphony of fake concern. I let her embrace me, my body limp in her arms. I'm fine, Sarah. Just needed some time. Of course you did, David said, coming over and clapping me on the shoulder. It was a gesture of ownership, of dominance. It was a lot to handle. But look, the company is more stable than ever. In the end, it was for the best. I'm glad to hear it, I said, my voice soft, my eyes downcast. I let them see the defeated sister, the fragile daughter. I let them feel magnanimous, generous in their victory. We sat at the large oak table, the same one where my father used to lay out his plans and blueprints. My mother chattered nervously, filling the silence. Sarah talked about their trip to Italy, the new wing they were adding to their house. David talked about a new acquisition, a tech startup. He spoke with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never truly been tested, who had taken a shortcut to the throne and believed he had earned it. You know, Anna, he said, leaning forward, I've been thinking. There's a position in the foundation's charity arm. It's not demanding. Mostly event planning. It would be a good way for you to stay connected. Keep busy. It was a breadcrumb. A pathetic offering to assuage his own guilt. To put me in a neat little box where I could do no harm. Sarah beamed. What a wonderful idea, darling. You'd be great at that, Anna. All your creative energy. I took a slow sip of water. I looked at my brother, really looked at him. At the man who shared my blood but not my father's integrity. Thank you, David. That's very thoughtful. Let me think about it. My compliance, my meekness was the perfect camouflage. I could see the relief in their eyes. The Anna problem was being solved. She was being managed. They had won so completely, they couldn't even conceive of a world where I might be fighting back. After the brunch, I didn't go home. I drove for 2 hours out of the city, into the rolling hills of the countryside where the cell service was spotty and the trees grew thick and old. I ended up at a small cluttered workshop behind a rusty barn. The sign was faded, almost illegible. Alex's Digital Restorations and Solutions. Alex was an old friend from college. A genius who saw the world in lines of code and data streams. He dropped out to follow his own path. A path that led him far away from the corporate world I had inhabited. He was sitting in front of a bank of monitors, his face illuminated by the glow, a soldering iron in his hand. He looked up as I entered, and his tired face broke into a genuine smile. Well, look what the cat dragged in. I heard you joined the ranks of the unemployed. The news travels fast, I said, leaning against a workbench covered in dissected hard drives and circuit boards. Your brother is not a subtle man, Alex said, putting down the iron and swiveling in his chair. So, is this a social call? Or do you need me to break something? Neither, I said. I need you to find something. His eyes sharpened. Find what? A ghost. A digital ghost. A company called Northgate Holdings. It's a shell corporation, I'm almost certain. Registered in Delaware. I need to know who owns it, who funds it, and what its purpose is. But more importantly, I need to know if there's any link, any connection at all, no matter how faint, between Northgate and a man named Marcus Thorne. Alex whistled softly. Marcus Thorne. The former zoning commissioner? The one who retired to the Caribbean right after the light rail announcement. The very same, I said. He typed the names into one of his keyboards. Lines of text scrolled rapidly down the screen. This isn't a simple search, Anna. This is a deep dive. If they've covered their tracks properly, it could take weeks. It could lead to a lot of dead ends. I have time, I said. And I have a feeling it's not a dead end. I transferred a sum of money to his account from my phone. A significant sum from my personal savings. He glanced at the notification and nodded. All right. I'll start rattling the cages. I'll let you know when I have something more than just static. Thank you, Alex. Discreetly. Discretion is my middle name, he said with a wry smile. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the one place I hadn't been since my father died. The old house. Not the grand family home my mother still lived in, but the small quiet house on the lake he had kept as a personal retreat. He'd left it to me in his will, a decision that had annoyed David to no end. It's a money pit, he'd said. Just sell it. I never did. I let myself in with the old brass key. The air inside was still and cool, thick with the scent of dust and cedar and memories. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Books on the tables, a half-finished chess game on the board by the fireplace, a faint smell of pipe tobacco lingering in the heavy curtains. I went to his study. It was a small room paneled in dark wood, overlooking the gray, choppy water of the lake. Behind a large, framed map of the world was the thing I had come for. A wall safe. I had the combination memorized, a sequence of numbers from my father's life. The year he met my mother, the day I was born, the day he founded the company. The tumblers clicked one by one. The heavy steel door swung open with a low groan. Inside, there weren't stacks of cash or jewels. There were just a few boxes of documents, old stock certificates, and one other thing. A sleek black external hard drive. It was labeled with a single word in my father's handwriting. Legacy. I took it and sat down in his old leather armchair. For a moment I just held it, the cool metal heavy in my palm. My father was a man of redundancies, of backups. He trusted people, but he also understood their weaknesses. He had taught me to play chess, to always think 5 moves ahead. David saw the pieces on the board. My father saw the entire game stretching out into the future. and he had left me a map. I drove back to my small apartment, the hard drive on the seat beside me like a silent passenger. The city lights seemed different now, not just a sea of indifferent brightness, but a network, a grid, a system with rules and pathways I was beginning to understand in a whole new way. That evening, I plugged the drive into my laptop. It was encrypted, of course, but the password wasn't a word. It was the final move in the half-finished chess game on the table in his study. Queen to bishop 7. Checkmate. I smiled. Even from the grave, he was still teaching me. The drive opened. It was a mirror of the company's entire digital history. Every email, every contract, every financial record since its inception. But it was more than that. It was annotated. My father had created a second hidden layer of data. Private notes attached to certain files. Cross-references. Unsent emails he had drafted. I started with the Black Creek deal. And there it was. A thread. A series of emails between David and the company's offshore accounting firm. Discussions about setting up a consultancy firm for a third party. The name of the firm was Northgate Holdings. My breath caught in my chest. I kept digging. I found a draft of an email from my father to his personal lawyer, dated a month before he died. He was worried. David's ambition is starting to cloud his judgment, he wrote. He's taking risks, making connections I'm not comfortable with. He's working with Sarah's uncle, a political lobbyist, on the side. I fear he's trying to build his own empire within mine, and he's using company resources to do it. I need to put stronger checks and balances in place. Perhaps it's time to make Anna's role as my successor official and legally binding. He never sent it. He had a heart attack 2 days later. And then I found the file that made the cold purpose inside me burn. It was a voice memo. My father must have recorded it in his car. It was scratchy, the sound of the road humming in the background. It was a recording of a phone call. His voice and the voice of Marcus Thorne. The payment has been made, Marcus, my father was saying, his voice strained, angry. To the holding company you specified. I don't like this. This is not how I do business. It's just a finder's fee, Richard. Thorne's voice was slick, oily. A token of appreciation for a valuable tip. The city expansion is public knowledge now anyway. No one can prove when I knew or who I told. It's clean. Your son David, he understands. He's a practical man. My son, my father said, and the weariness in his voice was a physical blow. Understands nothing. The recording ended. I sat back, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my face in the dark room. The pieces weren't just on the board anymore. They were all connected. David hadn't just used my foresight against me. He had been part of a conspiracy to bribe a public official, using a shell corporation to funnel the money, and then he had framed me for the reckless spending that was, in reality, the cost of his crime. He had leveraged his own corruption to steal our father's company from me. I closed the laptop. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The lights blinked. The traffic flowed. A world full of people living their lives, unaware of the silent tectonic shifts happening in rooms like mine. There would be no shouting, no tearful confrontations. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a dramatic scene. I was going to do what my father taught me. I was going to be methodical. I was going to be precise. I was going to use their own arrogance, their own greed, their own carefully constructed lies as the foundation for their downfall. I picked up my phone and sent a short, encrypted message to Arthur Harrison. I have the context. And the proof. To Alex I sent another. Northgate Holdings. The money came from us. Find the outgoing trail. I know where it went. I just need you to prove it. Then I did the last thing. I opened the text message from David, the one about the job at the foundation. I typed out a reply. I've thought about it. I'd love to. It sounds like exactly what I need right now. Thank you. I added a smiling emoji. And as I hit send, I felt the first real smile touch my own lips in months. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a chess player who sees the board with perfect clarity, who knows that checkmate is not just possible, but inevitable. The game had begun. The scent of wilting lilies and stale coffee hung in the air, a cloying perfume of grief. I walked through the halls of the house I'd always known but never felt was mine. Every surface was a mirror, not of my reflection, but of a life I had served. The gleam on the mahogany dining table where I'd set 10,000 meals. The polished floorboards I'd knelt on to scrub away the scuffs of other people's lives. My footsteps were silent on the thick Persian rugs, a habit learned over years of not wanting to disturb, of making myself smaller, quieter, invisible. My brother Mark was in the library, the heart of the house, the one room our father had truly lived in. I could hear the clink of ice in his glass, a sound that had become the punctuation mark to his days. Since the funeral this morning, he had worn his grief like a new suit, uncomfortable, but expensive and meant to impress. He'd shaken hands, accepted condolences with a somber nod, all while his eyes darted around the room, taking inventory of his new kingdom. He saw the house, the art, the stock portfolio. He never saw what was truly valuable. He never saw Dad. Not really. I paused at the library door, my hand resting on the cool brass knob. My fingers were raw from ringing them for the past 48 hours, not from sorrow, but from a strange humming anticipation. This was the last door. Behind it lay the final act of a play I hadn't known I was rehearsing for my entire life. 4 years I was the dutiful daughter, the caregiver, the ghost in the machine of this family. The one who stayed. The one who sacrificed a career, friends, a life of my own, to manage the medications, the appointments, the long rambling nights when Dad's mind wandered back to my mother. Mark called it my free ride. He'd say it with a smirk over holiday dinners. Must be nice, Annie. No rent, no responsibilities. Just looking after the old man. He had no concept of the responsibility, the crushing weight of holding someone's life in your hands, of being the sole keeper of their dignity. He would visit for an hour, clap Dad on the back, talk too loudly about his latest business venture, and then leave satisfied he'd done his filial duty. He never saw the way Dad's hand would tremble after he left, the exhaustion in his eyes. I pushed the door open. Mark was standing by the fireplace, one hand on the mantelpiece, staking his claim. Mr. Albright, our family's lawyer for 3 decades, sat in one of the wingback chairs, his briefcase resting on his knees. He looked tired, his face a roadmap of other people's troubles. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Ah, there she is," Mark said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Come on in, Annie. Sit down. This won't take long." He gestured to the chair opposite Mr. Albright, the one for petitioners, for guests. He remained standing, the lord of the manor. I didn't sit. I walked over to the bay window that overlooked the gardens, the ones Dad and I had planned together every spring. "The roses are coming in nicely," I said, my voice even. Mark sighed, a gust of theatrical impatience. "Annie, we don't have time for gardening commentary. Let's get this over with. Mr. Albright has a dinner to get to." Mr. Albright cleared his throat. "Mark, if we could just wait for a moment. There is one other party to this meeting." Mark's perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitted together. "Other party? Who?" "It's just me and Annie. The will is straightforward. I'm the executor, the sole heir to the estate, with a small provision for Annie's continued care." He said the words "continued care," as if he were discussing a stray cat he'd have to put down. The library doors opened again. A woman I'd never seen before walked in. She was sharp, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, and carried a briefcase that looked far more modern and menacing than Mr. Albright's worn leather one. "This is Miss Davies," Mr. Albright said, a hint of relief in his voice. "She represents." "I represent the SR Trust," Ms. Davies said, her voice crisp and cool. She didn't look at Mark. She looked at me. "Are you ready to proceed, Ms. Reed?" I turned from the window. "I am. Thank you for coming." Mark let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A trust? What the hell is this? Dad didn't have a trust. We have the will. Right here." He gestured towards Mr. Albright's briefcase. "The one he signed 10 years ago. The one that leaves everything to me." That is correct, Mr. Albright said carefully. I am here to execute the last will and testament of your father signed 10 years ago. However, a will can only dispense assets held by the deceased at the time of their death. And, Mark prompted, his patience fraying. He held everything. This house, the company shares, the portfolio. Ms. Davies placed her briefcase on the large oak desk and opened it with 2 sharp clicks. Actually, she said without a flicker of emotion, he didn't. As of 18 months ago, Mr. Samuel Reed held title to his personal effects, a checking account with a balance of $7,412, and his 2012 sedan. Everything else, this house, the ancillary properties, the entirety of his stock portfolio, and his controlling interest in Reed & Son Manufacturing, was transferred into an irrevocable trust, the SR Trust. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Mark's face, which had been a mask of smug pity, was slowly collapsing. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty gray sheen. "What?" he whispered. It was the smallest sound I had ever heard him make. "The SR Trust," Ms. Davies repeated, as if speaking to a child. "An entity of which your father was the grantor. The execution of which I am here to oversee." This is a joke," Mark stammered, looking wildly between Mr. Albright and the new lawyer. He was sick. His mind, he wasn't capable of making these kinds of decisions. He pointed a trembling finger at me. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a sick old man. This is elder abuse. I'll have it thrown out. I'll have her thrown in jail. I finally moved from the window and sat down in the chair Mark had offered me. I crossed my legs and folded my hands in my lap. For the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of my own space in this room. "He knew you'd say that," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his rising hysteria. "He knew you'd call him incompetent. He knew you'd accuse me. Of course you'd say that. You've been poisoning him against me for years." "On the contrary, Mark," I said, leaning forward slightly. "I never said a word against you. I didn't have to. You did all the work yourself." I looked at Ms. Davies. "The first file, please. The one labeled, The Callaway Deal." Ms. Davies slid a thin binder across the polished desk. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. "Do you remember the Callaway deal, Mark? About 2 years ago? You wanted Dad to leverage the company to take out a massive loan to acquire a competitor that was, in your words, a guaranteed home run. Dad was hesitant. He said the numbers didn't feel right. It was a solid deal. Mark insisted, his voice cracking. We would have cornered the market. You told him he was an old man who'd lost his nerve." I continued, my voice a flat monotone. "You told him his caution was going to run the company into the ground. I remember your exact words. You said, 'It's time for the new generation to take the reins, Dad. You've had your time.' You said it right here in this room." I was in the hall, bringing him his afternoon tea. Mark stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. "He didn't want to fight you. He was tired of fighting you. So he told you to go ahead, to draw up the preliminary paperwork. But that night he called me in here. He asked me to look at the financials for Callaway. Not as his daughter, but as the woman with an MBA from Wharton that you always forgot he paid for. The degree you told everyone I wasted to become a glorified nurse." I let that hang in the air for a moment. The color was starting to come back to Mark's face, but it was a blotchy, angry red. "Callaway was a shell, wasn't it, Mark? Riddled with debt, cooking their books for the last 3 quarters. The acquisition would have bankrupted us. You didn't do your due diligence. You just saw a shiny object and wanted it. Dad saw it in one night. It took me 2 days to compile the full report confirming it. That was the first time he looked at me and said, 'I've been a fool, Annie. Not about business. About my children.' That's a lie," he spat. "You're twisting things." "Miss Davies," I said calmly. "The video file. March 12th. The lawyer turned her laptop around. She clicked a file. Our father's face appeared on the screen. He looked tired, older than he was, but his eyes were sharp, clear. He was sitting in his favorite chair, The one right next to where Mr. Albright was now frozen. "This is Samuel Reed." His voice, thin but firm, filled the room. "The date is March 12th. My son Mark has just left. We discussed the Callaway acquisition. He was insistent. I have reason to believe his judgment is compromised by his ambition. For the protection of the company my father built, and for the security of its employees, I have asked my daughter, Anne, to conduct a private audit of the proposal. I am of sound mind and body, and I am making this recording with my legal counsel present to attest to my state." The video showed him turning to another man, a lawyer I now recognize from my meetings with Ms. Davies. Ms. Davies stopped the video. "There are 117 such recordings, Mr. Reed, documenting every major financial discussion, every decision, every time your father's capacity was questioned or his directives were ignored by you. Each one is time-stamped, notarized, and witnessed." Mark sank into the chair opposite me. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. The bravado, the anger, the arrogance. It all bled out of him, leaving a hollow shell. "That was the beginning," I said, my voice softer now, almost conversational. "After that, Dad and I worked together. Every day. You thought I was reading him novels in the afternoon. I was reading him quarterly reports. You thought I was helping him with his crossword puzzles. We were wargaming market fluctuations. You thought I was taking him for slow drives in the country. We were meeting with Ms. Davies and a new team of financial advisors, the ones who structured the trust. I remembered those days. The quiet intensity, the shared secret. It was the most alive I'd ever felt. It was the most time I'd ever truly had with my father. He wasn't just my patient, he was my mentor. He was sharp, brilliant, and deeply sad about what he had to do. A man's legacy isn't what he builds, he told me one afternoon, looking out at the roses. It's what he protects. "Why?" Mark whispered. His eyes locked on the blank laptop screen. "Why wouldn't he just tell me?" "Because he knew you wouldn't listen," I said. "Because every time he tried to teach you, you saw it as a criticism. Every time he offered caution, you saw it as a weakness. He spent 30 years trying to hand you his life's work, and you treated it like a toy. He didn't do this to punish you, Mark. He did it to protect the company, to protect his employees, to protect his own name." Mr. Albright finally spoke, his voice raspy. "The will," he said, tapping his briefcase. "I am still required to read it." He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "It's very brief. To my son Mark, I leave my sincerest hope that he will find a path that brings him fulfillment, and the sum of $100,000 to aid him on that journey." Mark just stared. $100,000. To him it was an insult. A tip. It was just enough to make a legal challenge almost impossible to justify. "And the rest?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "The will continues," Mr. Albright read, his eyes on the page. "All remaining personal effects, property, and accounts held in my name at the time of my death, I leave to my daughter and Reed. She was the one who stayed. She was the one who listened. She was the one who understood that my legacy wasn't the money, but the responsibility that came with it. It is all hers, for she has already earned it." I looked at my brother. The great Mark Reed, the titan of industry, the heir apparent. He looked small, shrunken. He wasn't looking at me or the lawyers. He was staring at the portrait of our father that hung above the fireplace. He was seeing him, really seeing him for the first time. And it was too late. "The trust," I said, bringing his attention back to me. "It's structured with a board of directors. I am the chairman. As my first official act, I will be accepting your resignation from Reed and Son, effective immediately." He flinched as if I'd struck him. "You can stay in the house for 30 days, I continued, the words coming easily, pre-planned and emotionless, "to make arrangements. After that, this is no longer your home. A severance package has been prepared for you. It's generous. More generous than Dad thought it should be. That was my decision." I stood up. The lawyers were already packing their briefcases, their work done. The room felt bigger, the air lighter. "You were right about one thing, Mark," I said, walking towards the door. He didn't look up. All those years I did have a free ride. Dad gave me the greatest gift of all. He gave me his trust. He gave me his time. He taught me everything he knew. While you were out taking from him, I was learning from him. While you were trying to take over his company, he was giving it to me. I paused at the door and looked back at him, a shrunken figure in a room full of ghosts and memories. He had built his entire identity on being the son, the heir, the one who mattered. And in a single afternoon, he had learned he was nothing more than a footnote in his own father's story. There was no rage left in him. No fight. Just a vast, empty silence. The stunning, hollow quiet of a man who has just realized he has been playing the wrong game his entire life. And the final score was already in. I walked out of the library and closed the door behind me, leaving him alone with the truth. The scent of lilies was still in the air, but now it no longer smelled of grief. It smelled of peace. The scent of roasted turkey and simmering gravy was supposed to smell like home. For years I'd convinced myself it did. But that evening it smelled like an obligation. A thick, cloying perfume meant to cover the scent of decay. The crystal glasses on my mother's dining table, the ones I polished just an hour before, reflected a distorted version of our family. My father, a ghost at the head of the table, smiling weakly at nothing in particular. My brother, Mark, looking antsy and entitled, already swirling his wine as if he'd earned it. And my mother, the conductor of this sad orchestra, her eyes darting between us, making sure we all played our part. My part, for 29 years, had been the audience, the stagehand, and the silent benefactor. Tonight I was just waiting for my cue. Mark was just telling us about his new venture, my mother began, her voice a little too bright. It's incredibly promising. A new app for connecting artisan dog walkers. Isn't that clever, honey? She looked at me, her smile a carefully painted fixture. I picked at a loose thread on the linen napkin. Is it? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Mark shifted in his seat, the fabric of his expensive suit whispering. It's a niche market, Clara. Ian, you wouldn't get it. It requires significant seed capital to get off the ground, to build the infrastructure. Seed capital. Infrastructure. He used words he'd learned from podcasts, stringing them together like cheap pearls. The last time he'd used those words, my savings account, the one I'd been building since my first part-time job at 15, had evaporated. It had been for a disruptive coffee subscription box that never shipped a single order. And that's where we, as a family, come in, my mother continued, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Mark's arm. We support each other. We lift each other up. Her gaze found me again, sharp and insistent. It wasn't a request, it was an invoice. I looked at my plate, at the way the gravy was slowly congealing around the mashed potatoes. I thought of the canvases stacked in my tiny apartment, the smell of turpentine that clung to my clothes, the ache in my shoulders after 12 hours of painting. I thought of the gallery owner who'd called last week, the one who'd said my work had a haunted quality, and wanted to offer me a solo show. A real one. In another city. A city where the air didn't taste of disappointment. Clara, did you hear me? My mother's voice cut through the memory. Your father and I were thinking. That little nest egg from Grandma's house, you've barely touched it. It's just sitting there. Could be put to good use. For the family. The nest egg. The money my grandmother, the only person who had ever seen me, had left specifically for me. The money she pressed into my hand in a thin envelope, her skin like paper, and whispered, "For your art, my little bird. For your wings." They told me to put it in a joint account for safekeeping. I was so young I believed them. I slowly placed my fork and knife on the plate, the silver clinking softly against the porcelain. The sound was deafening in the sudden silence. I looked up, not at my mother but at my father. His eyes wouldn't meet mine. They were fixed on the floral centerpiece, as if it held the secrets to the universe. He had always been an expert in looking away. I sold the last of my Blue Period series last month, I said, my voice even. The ones you said were too depressing to hang in the house. My mother waved a dismissive hand. That's nice, dear. A little pocket money from your hobby. It was enough to hire a forensic accountant. I continued, my gaze unwavering. My father's head snapped up. Mark's wineglass paused halfway to his lips. My mother's smile tightened, the cracks beginning to show. "What a strange thing to do," she said, her laugh brittle. "I thought so too," I agreed. But I kept having this feeling that I was bad with money. Every time I saved something, it just seemed to disappear. First, the college fund I worked 2 jobs to contribute to, which mysteriously ran dry when Mark decided to study abroad for a semester in Spain. Then the down payment I'd saved for a studio, which was borrowed for the deposit on Mark's first luxury car, so he could project success. And then, of course, the coffee business. I finally looked at Mark. For the first time all night, the smugness was gone. He just looked like a scared little boy. "The accountant found it all, of course," I said, almost conversationally. "It wasn't hard. The transfers, the withdrawals, the account statements you've been hiding from me for years. Even the money from Grandma's house. Every last cent went to covering Mark's debts. His gambling, his bad investments, his lifestyle." My mother's face was a mask of cold fury. "How dare you? In this house, you throw these vile accusations." "They aren't accusations." I reached into my purse and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. I slid it across the polished wood of the table. It stopped just short of the centerpiece. "It's just a record. A ledger. I don't want the money back. I know it's gone. I just wanted you to know that I know." My father finally spoke, his voice raspy. "Clara, we were going to tell you. We were just waiting for the right time. Mark was going to pay it all back." "Was he?" I asked, my voice filled with a genuine, sorrowful curiosity. Was he going to pay back the 20 years I spent believing I was incompetent? The nights I lay awake convinced I was a failure because I couldn't seem to get ahead? Was he going to pay back the paintings I couldn't afford to paint, the opportunities one missed because I was always putting out your fires? Silence. A thick, heavy blanket of it. The turkey was getting cold. "I am not angry," I said, and the most surprising thing was that it was true. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving behind a strange, clean emptiness. "I am just done. I am done being the foundation you all stand on, just so you can have a better view." My mother slammed her hand on the table. The glasses rattled. "After everything we've done for you, we gave you a home. We fed you. And this is the thanks we get. You ungrateful child." I stood up, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. I looked around the room, at the gilded frames holding pictures of a happy family that never existed. I saw the ghosts of every time I'd made myself smaller, quieter, less, so that they could feel bigger, louder, more. "You didn't give me a home," I said, my voice soft but clear. "You gave me a cage. A very comfortable cage with good food. I'll grant you that. But my entire life, I have been singing for my supper. And I'm tired of the song." I walked to the front door, my purse held loosely in my hand. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me burning into my spine. I could feel their shock, their indignation turning to panic as they realized the bank was closing. I opened the door. The cool night air felt like a benediction on my skin. I stepped out onto the porch. "My things will be picked up tomorrow," I said into the silence behind me. "The movers will be here at 9. Please don't be here." I closed the door behind me, not slamming it, but shutting it with a quiet final click. I walked down the stone path, past the manicured rose bushes my mother was so proud of. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I just walked. Each step was a word in a language I was just learning: freedom, sovereignty, peace. The drive away from that house was the quietest drive of my life. I didn't turn on the radio. I just listened to the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. The farther I got, the lighter the air seemed to become, as if I had been driving with an invisible weight on the roof of my car for my entire life, and it had finally just lifted off and floated away. My new apartment was small. Just a single large room with a kitchenette and a bathroom. The walls were bare and white, and the wooden floors were scuffed. It had one huge, north-facing window that looked out over a tangle of rooftops and fire escapes. When the movers brought my things the next day, my bed, my easel, a few boxes of books and clothes, the place still felt vast. For the first time, there was more room for me than there was for my things. Months passed. The seasons turned. I painted. I painted with a ferocity I hadn't felt since I was a child. I painted the light as it fell across the floorboards. I painted the view from my window in the rain. I painted huge, abstract canvases full of colors I hadn't dared to use before. Furious reds, joyful yellows, deep, peaceful blues. The haunted quality the gallery owner had seen was slowly being replaced by something else. Something that felt like light. My phone would buzz sometimes. A text from my father. "We're worried about you." A long rambling voicemail from my mother. Veering from guilt to rage and back again. A single pathetic message from Mark. "Can we talk?" I never answered. There was nothing left to say. Their words were echoes from a room I had already left. From a life that no longer belonged to me. My solo show opened on a crisp autumn evening. The gallery was full of strangers, their faces illuminated by the track lighting, their voices a low, pleasant murmur. They stood in front of my paintings, and I watched them from a quiet corner. I saw them lean in, step back, nod, and whisper to each other. They were seeing my work. But more than that, they were seeing me. The real me, the one that had been buried under years of duty and denial. The gallery owner found me, a glass of champagne in his hand. "They love it, Clara," he said, his smile genuine. "They truly love it. You've said something here." I looked across the room at my largest piece. It was a canvas that exploded with color. A chaotic but beautiful storm of light breaking through darkness. At the very center, almost hidden, was a tiny bird, its wings spread wide, taking flight. I took a sip of champagne, the bubbles cold and sharp against my tongue. The house I left behind was no longer filled with fake laughter, but with a silence I could only imagine. It was the sound of a vacuum, of a support beam being removed. My silence, the one I lived in now, was different. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was the quiet hum of possibility, the gentle scratch of a brush on canvas, the sound of my own breath, steady and free. I walked away from them without a single curse, but I had left them with something far heavier. Their own reflection.